Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. Our mission is to see a world well led. And our strategy to get there? To empower leaders like you to lead every day. So let's get to work.
What would happen if everyone around you were constantly getting smarter? Today, we're going to dive into that question. Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. I'm Randy Gravitt.
And I'm Mark Miller.
And Mark, I'm glad you're with us because you're constantly advocating for getting a bunch of smart people around you and trying to build a team. And last week, you even in our conversation about harmony, if anybody missed that, we didn't get too crazy off the range there, but we talked about trying to create a life of harmony using the orchestra conductor. One of the things you said in that was you raised the question, who can help? And it made me start thinking about the power of having a team of people around your life. And today we'll kind of go back to work, the mindset of building a great team, so to speak. But what happens if we can get smarter people around us? You've been the king of putting a bunch of smart people in a room and creating all kind of fun projects. And I'm not sure I've been there because I'm smart, but I've gotten to be a fly on the wall some of those times. And we've been around some really smart people. And I think the better the acumen in the room is, the better the project ends up being. And so I think there's some things that we can do. We've identified 7 of them. We're going to dive into them today. So welcome to the show, Mark, and welcome everybody out there in podcast land.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun topic because, as you mentioned, we've both been very fortunate to be in some rooms with some really smart people. And sometimes those are men and women on our day-to-day teams. And sometimes we bring in really smart people. And I think if I look back over the folks that I've had the privilege to work with over the last 40 years, I keep going back to some of the same people. And I don't think I go back to them because they're so smart as much as I go back to them because they're continuing to learn and grow. They're smarter today than they were 20 years ago when I first met them, 30 years ago when I first met them, because they're not resting on their innate ability or their God-given IQ. They've just sold out to getting smarter. And those are the kind of people that I love to work with.
Yeah, I think the same thing, but I would say really for me, I always try to get them around me because they're always smarter than I am. So that's kind of where my starting place is always, let's find some people who are smarter than me.
Yeah, let me say this. If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
You're in the wrong room. I love
You're
that.
in the wrong room.
Well, I'm always in the right room because I'm rarely the smartest person in the room. Even when I'm hanging out with the preschoolers, they're asking better questions than I am. So I'm still learning here, but I am trying to get smarter. And I think that's where we want to take the conversation today. Let's talk about the power of having a smart team, but how do we get the people around us to grow smarter as well? How do we help them grow? How do we create an environment where that can happen? And I think it starts, Mark, again, we're going to give 7 things here, but I think it starts with the expectation. And you've been really the one who throughout the last couple of decades of my life has talked to me about, your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead, and really leadership. Maxwell said is influence. If you're going to have impact, you got to keep growing. I think that's something great you've taught me through the years. I've had so many people who've taught me that, but you've been at the front of that line. So say something about setting that expectation with those teams that you've led. How important is that?
Well, I think it needs to be one of the values or one of the norms that you establish. And I don't think it needs to be inferred or implied. I just think you need to talk about it. And when I would start a new team for years, that'd be one of the first things we talk about is we're going to expect each other to continue to learn and grow. And I really didn't think that much about it until I ran into a guy on one of my teams that said he wasn't interested in that. It's like kind of caught me by surprise. He ultimately couldn't be on the team because that's a non-negotiable. That's a non-starter for somebody to go, yeah, I'm just not into that. Well, okay, then we have to find some other way or place for you to serve. So I just think you need to be very open, very overt, and say, this is something we value, and this is actually an expectation. Now, if you're wondering, how do you pay that off? Well, you need to pay attention to these other half dozen ideas, but it really does begin with an expectation.
Yeah, if you're leading an organization or a team in this case, and you don't have that expectation for everybody to grow, I think you're going to have a really hard time achieving what you're trying to, chasing high performance, however you want to say that. But I always like to remind leaders when we're talking at a team's level that you almost want this mindset of everybody needs to be growing or they ought to be going. I mean, you literally don't want them on your team if they're going to be a stagnant, player on the team. You got to keep raising the level if the team's going to improve. It's only going to improve if everybody gets better. And I think there's times where we may need to even make a shift here, because we may have gotten complacent as a team. Maybe there's somebody out there listening who's saying, okay, well, I'm not sure we're growing like we should. How would I institute this? If this is going to be a new expectation, you got to communicate it. I mean, I think this is something, you said it, we've got to talk about this a lot, and not just we need to be growing, but what are you learning? How does it apply? What are you reading? I mean, all those kind of questions that fill our hallways and our text threads and our meeting, the spaces in our meetings that are not on the agenda. I mean, I think that healthy conversation about what we're all doing to get better really does become a powerful, maybe even a catalytic, fuse really to get us burning toward the next place. I mean, I think it's amazing when a team does get smarter together, but it doesn't happen if there's not that expectation typically.
Yeah. You don't want to leave it to chance. It's just too important. And I think the next thing I would say, you referenced it, but you can set the expectation as the leader, and I think you should, but you've got to show people the way. There's some teams where learning and growing is not a value and it's not the norm, and the leader's not in a position to address it because he or she doesn't have the moral authority to challenge others to learn and grow. And the reason they don't is that they've not made a commitment to lifelong learning. And so I think you've got to model it. We often say that people always watch the leader, whether you want them to or not. And so I think you've got to demonstrate your passion and your commitment to learning and growing.
Yeah. So be sharing what I'm learning, and if I'm not learning or growing as the leader, then again, as you're alluding to there, I don't really have the moral authority to ask somebody else to grow if I'm not going to do it myself. So yeah, I think that's a good reminder there. It's one of my favorite phrases I've ever heard you say, that you talk about this all the time, but people always watch the leader. We really do have to model what we want others to follow if we're going to be as effective as we can be.
Yeah. And again, there'll be any number of tactics that you can employ. I've worked for several leaders. One specifically comes to mind. When he would read a great book, he'd come to the meeting and give us all a copy and say, hey, I just read this, and I think it'd be helpful for you. And he had a reputation. He didn't give bad books away. And that's something I've tried to model over the years. Somebody actually told me one day, they said, you've never given me a bad book. And I said, and I don't ever plan to give you a bad book, right? I'm only going to give you the good ones. I've got other leaders that would circulate articles, things they had read in a magazine or something online that they would forward because they found value in it and they thought that I might. And sometimes it was a one size fit all. They might send something to an entire team, but some of the most meaningful moments is when they shared what they were learning that they thought specifically would apply to me and my situation, something I was working on or something I was struggling with or something I was trying to learn. And so you can do the one size fits all, and you can do the very specific sharing of information that lets people know that you're in the game as well.
Yeah, in today's world, it's easy to share a podcast or a book, an article, a blog. I mean, as you said, even if you wanted to have this conversation, you might have everybody listen to this episode and say, let's have a conversation about our growth mindset here on our team. So I think that's really great. Okay, so I think this next one might feel a little bit. I think everybody's going to go. That sounds right, but there are going to be pockets who are going to go. That's not doable. And so here it is. It's ask everyone to have a development plan. Ask everybody to have a development plan. Now I know there are companies, organizations, leaders listening. You're going, we have a development plan. That's easy for us. We already have it. I'll say something to them in just a second. But there are others who are listening who are, more in the trenches of work, and they would say, we don't have time. In fact, I ran into an organization. I was speaking for an organization a few months back, a group of plumbers, and a guy, I thought he was going to throw a wrench at me. He's like, dude, we're plumbers. We don't have development plans. We can't have that. And what I told him was a development plan can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be. The development plan is not the goal. The goal is for the person that's using the development plan to grow. And so what I told him was, you can literally have a napkin or a 3x5 card and sit down with Steve across the table and say, Steve, tell me 2 or 3 areas where you want to get better over the next 90 days or the next year, however you want to put the time on it. Or Steve, let me give you a couple of areas, a couple of challenges where I want you to get better. And it could be on that little card, and you can come back to that card month after month after month and make sure that Steve is aware of it, and that hopefully Steve's wanting to make progress and is making progress. Can be really powerful. But for the person who's in a more, an organization that would have development plans, I think so many times I've seen people have a great annual plan, and yet that plan gets stuck in a drawer and they don't really look at it day after day after day. I want you to say something, Mark, about that, because I know you've been a proponent of looking and reviewing your plan every day. And I think that's been a powerful, catalyst for you making even more progress when you started doing that.
Yeah. I just, as you and many others do, we try to get smarter as it relates to our annual planning process. And a few years back, I began to ask myself, what was the greatest single determining factor to the level of execution as I look back over the decades? And I said, the more I review my plan, the more successful I am at executing my plan. I've got a short memory, a short memory and a short attention span. And so if I could develop the habit of reviewing it more often, I felt like it could help me with execution. And that's exactly what happened. But you gave me a breakthrough idea, because as you said, a development plan can be on a napkin or a 3x5 card, but it could also be a multi-page document. And I've tinkered with that over the years, and I'll do things that are more elaborate and things that are more succinct. But you challenged me. You said an NFL coach might have a playbook that would be this thick if they printed it out.
If you're watching on YouTube, Mark's got 4 or 5 inches here. I mean, a big, thick playbook.
Yeah, big, thick book. But you see them on the sidelines, they've got a play sheet, and sometimes it's front and back, and they've distilled the essence of what they need from that playbook into that. And you challenged me, what if you create a plan summary? So even in a year where I may do a multi-page document for my annual plan, I've now for several years, I've decided I'm going to create a summary. And sometimes I can get it on one page. Sometimes it takes front and back, and it's much, much easier to review. So it facilitates that process. But I want to go back. That may or may not be helpful for you. You've got to figure out what helped you execute your plan. But I want to go back to, you said there are two organizations, one where people say they don't have a development plan, and another type of organization where they have them, but they stick them in the file cabinet. I'd say the predominant organization that I've encountered over the years are places where you only have a development plan if you're in trouble. If your job is at risk, you have a development plan. And I just think that's weird. I would say everybody needs a development plan. Some of our listeners know that I spent 4.5 decades working for Chick-fil-A Incorporated, and I'm quick to offer disclaimers. We did not have everything figured out. They don't have everything figured out today. But about 30 years ago, 25 years ago, we required our field staff to everybody have an individual development plan. Now, what's so interesting about that from my perspective, that was probably 5 years before we asked them to create their annual business plan. So you get that in your head. We were saying if these men and women are going to add maximum value, learning and growing has got to be a priority, so much so that we required them to create a development plan that had to be signed off by their supervisor, and then the supervisor would help them execute that plan and hold them accountable throughout the year. So again, that was years before we ever said, let's create a business plan and a P&L for your part of the business. It's that important, not just for people who are in trouble, because my premise is if you don't have a development plan, you're probably going to end up in trouble.
Yeah, you're probably already in trouble. Okay, you said something there that I think is maybe one of the most powerful things about the plan is the ability to discuss with my supervisor and really get coaching, real-time feedback on how I'm doing, how I'm progressing, all that. So powerful to me, as opposed to the organization where we have this annual meeting, evaluation meeting, review of my year, as opposed to ongoing conversation and coaching. Maybe we would use that word. I think the organizations that have an annual review and don't do any real-time coaching around the development plan, they're just leaving points on the table, so to speak. It's so important that we have that organic document that we can be updating all the time, tweaking all the time, improving on it. And I think we make much more progress when we're going after that. So to me, that I love that part of it as well, that it gives me a conversation starter with my supervisor, or if I'm supervising people, with them. I mean, it's going all over the organization if everybody's got this expectation of growing. So
yeah. Let me say one thing about that, about the supervisor piece. We're going to share a resource that I think will be helpful. But before we even get to that, the first priority in a development plan is to close any critical gaps. And that could be a blinding flash of the obvious, but I've encountered people that don't think like that. In fact, they're trying to avoid the things they don't do well. And sometimes those are actually critical and essential for their role. And so you got to close critical gaps. Well, one reason I like for people to talk to their supervisor about their development plan when they're creating it, not just 6 months, 9 months, 12 months later, is your supervisor may have a perspective that you don't have regarding a critical gap. You may say, I don't have any, or you may say, yeah, I've got one, but it's not that important. Well, your supervisor may look at it and go, no, that's actually really important. I was working with a team of business consultants decades ago, and one of those consultants was really struggling with consulting. And I knew that because I could look at the performance of those folks that he was consulting, and it was not good. Well, he knew he was struggling, but he didn't think that was as important as I did. And so we were able to adjust his development plan so that he could actually work on a core competence that was required by his role. So that's just another reason to talk to your supervisor. They'll help you identify those critical gaps.
That's great. Okay, so many people listening are probably familiar with development plans. They've had them. They would know what to do if they were going to create one. But there may be people listening, Mark, who have no idea, like, where would I even start? You mentioned a resource. Can you say something about that? Because we have created a resource.
Yeah.
Maybe help.
Yeah. It's a free PDF. It's called My Plan for Growth. And if you'll find the link in the show notes, that'll give you some steps that you can follow. And just a disclaimer, you're not really going to find a template there. I'm not a fan of templates in a lot of areas, but specifically as it relates to your personal growth, it needs to be a personalized plan that'll meet your needs. It'll align with your temperament, your personality, and your style. But I do think you'll find some things in that free PDF that'll be helpful for you.
Yeah, it's a powerful resource. That's great. Okay, so if the development plan gives us an opportunity to have a conversation with our supervisor about areas where we need to grow, critical gaps we need to close, maybe even strengths that we need to leverage, all that's great. But it also gives the supervisor an opportunity to know what's going on. And we actually, as leaders, in that case, have an opportunity to recognize growth. And I think that would be the next thing I would say, Mark, is it's if we're going to say growth is important, we need to make sure that we elevate it when it happens, right? If somebody's growing, we need to make heroes out of the people who are doing what we say is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it can be transformational, not just for the individual, but for the organization. We said earlier, people always watch the leader. People always watch, what is the leader recognizing? What is the leader rewarding? Plato articulated this a long, long time ago, and he said, what is honored in a country is cultivated there. And I would say what is honored in an organization is cultivated there. And so recognition is of learning and growth and development should be a prime candidate for a leader to recognize every chance they get.
I probably was not smart enough to quote Plato, but I've always heard it, and I'll just simplify it. What gets rewarded gets repeated. I think that's so true. It's if we are making heroes out of people who are doing what we want them to do, then more people are going to say that must be important, and I need to be doing that as well. And so, again, if it's the expectation for everyone, why would we not want to be elevating when people are living it out? It gives us a good chance to celebrate that. So that feels like an important one here. That I guess that would be number 4 in our list. So
is that number 4 or number 5? I've lost count.
I think we set the expectations. We model the way we want everybody to have one, and then we're going to recognize growth. I think number 5 is that we want to share as leaders what we're learning. You mentioned this earlier, but if we're not growing, then we really don't have the moral authority to ask somebody else to. But if we are growing, I think again, it just this kind of ties into number 2. But we get a chance to set the pace here and model this way. And I think as leaders, a lot of times we're thinking about stuff maybe at a little higher level than the person that is following it. I mean, they're probably thinking about the stuff they're thinking about, and I can't tell you how many times I've learned from my supervisor when they've talked about what they're like. And this happens with you all the time. I'm constantly listening to what you're learning, or the people on our team even, that it really doesn't matter if somebody's supervising somebody or not. But I would say if you are the leader of a team, you want to be sharing constantly what you're learning. And I just think that again is helping just reinforce maybe is the better word, that environment of growth.
Yeah. And you can ask others to do the same. One of the practices that we worked on for years and years and years and years, it was started by our CEO. Anytime he knew someone had been to a conference or an event, I know conferences and events aren't as in vogue today as they have been, but still, if you know someone has been in a learning environment, he would always say, when you get back, you got to share with all of us what you learned. And I know that I had the experience, it was 15 years ago, to spend a couple of months up at Harvard. And not only did I have the opportunity to share my learnings with my team, I had a chance to meet with the executive committee. They said, you just spent a couple of months at Harvard. Come on in. We're going to give you the floor. Let's talk about what you learned. And so it's not just sharing what you're learning, but create that expectation that others are going to share what they're learning. And what actually happens there is you accelerate learning, because if you're distilling the takeaways from an event or a conference or a book or time with a mentor or whatever, and you're trying to boil it down to the most salient, actionable nuggets, and then you share that, well, other people just got the benefit without the investment of time, energy, and effort, maybe even the financial investment that you made. They get the highlights from that experience. And so share what you're learning and create the expectation that other people will, and you'll be pleasantly surprised how much traction you can get with that.
Yeah, it's almost like we get to borrow the brains of the people around us when we have that mindset. I can't tell you how many times you may not even realize you do this, but when I'll go to something or I'll read something or go hang out with somebody, so many times you've told me through the years, take good notes, and because you're going to talk to me about it when we get back. And so, yeah, I love that mindset. It's just, you just build that into the way you think. I think it's powerful and it can change the behavior. Okay, another thing you've talked about through the years, Mark, and maybe we ought to call our old friend Bob Tiede. Shout out to Bob here on this one, because you've talked about the power of questions. Bob's written all these books on questions, but asking questions, asking more questions is we would put that in our list here. If you're going to create a growth environment, you want to build this discipline, I guess I would call it, or habit of asking more questions. Will you talk about that? I mean, you've helped me think about this so much through the years, the power of questions.
Yeah. Well, questions are kind of a Swiss Army knife, right? You can do so many things with thoughtful questions. And one of the things you do is you help people get smarter. Because when I ask a question, I'm going to get smarter because I'm going to hear your answer. You're going to get smarter because you've got to think. You've got to create a concise and compelling response. You've actually got to answer the question. And even if you don't know the answer, you're now a little bit smarter because you know what you don't know. And maybe if I'm the leader, I can say, well, can you figure that out? And then you've actually got an assignment that when you come back and answer that question, you'll be smarter, and then I will also. And one of the easiest questions, I tend to have favorite questions for a season. And for several years, my favorite question was, what are you learning? And you start asking people consistently, what are you learning? And they're going to understand, particularly if you're the leader. I mean, I think this works if you're not the leader, but if you're the leader and you start asking people, what are you learning? They're not going to want to say nothing. They're going to want to be learning because their leader's going to ask them that question and they want to have a credible and thoughtful response. So any number of questions, but you can start by just asking those around you. What are you learning?
Yeah. So anybody out there listening, if you want to accelerate this or even get into the game with this, maybe you think, well, we don't really have a learning organization. Just start with that one question. What are you learning? You start asking that to everyone in the building and watch what happens. People will, it'll adjust their behavior. It really will. I think that's a good reminder.
Yeah. Let me throw in one more. One of my mentors, this was a really good question. He would ask, what has become clearer to you since we last met?
Isn't that great?
So again, you don't have to be asked that question many times, and you're going to be more thoughtful. You're going to pay attention more.
You're going to be looking for clarity, aren't you?
And you're going to get smarter.
Yeah.
You're going to get smarter.
Okay, so we come down to our last one here, Mark, our seventh on the list of things that we can do to make everyone on our team smarter. And I think both of us are fans of trying to invest in the next generation, but I'd put it under the banner here of paying it forward, really just helping someone else, mentoring someone, we might call it that. Talk about the power of that and how we've prioritized that and really seen that not just benefit the people that we're trying to help, but we've been beneficiaries of people who have paid it forward to us through the years. So I think there's this to me, when leaders are invested in, there's nothing more powerful than they turn around and invest in somebody else. That to me is that's kind of the deal, right?
It is, but let's be sure we maintain the perspective. When we talk about folks getting smarter, I would say if you're going to mentor someone, if you're going to coach someone, if you're going to train someone, if you're going to try to help somebody grow, you're going to get smarter too. I mean, I don't know if this is like a universal law or something, but I know that it's actually true that the best way to learn something is to teach it, because you've got to internalize it. I got to spend some time a few years back with one of the world's leading authorities on accelerated learning, and his focus was on adults, helping adults with accelerated learning. And he had many, many strategies and tactics that he could deploy and taught me and our team many of those. But one of the ones that I was not surprised was one of the very first things he said. If you're trying to teach a group of adults anything, tell them before you start that they're going to have to teach it next hour. And then you teach for an hour. And then you give them an assignment, even if they're going to teach it to their neighbor. He said they'll learn more in that hour than they would typically learn in a day because you've just changed their paradigm. And now they've got to teach it. So they've got to understand it at a different level. They've got to internalize it. They've got to think of personal stories and applications and anecdotes that they can use to convey it to others. They may even jot down pictures and illustrations or key words and phrases that they want to be sure and share to that person they're going to be teaching later. And so if you'll commit to, as you said, Randy, pass it on, pay it forward, and think about that as a life value of paying it forward, you'll get smarter, and the people around you will get smarter because they'll be the recipients of your knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah, not to be self-serving, but I do think when we do pay it forward, we do teach it forward, to your point, it just galvanizes it in the mind and heart of the leader who's teaching that. It causes us to be more thoughtful, more clear. You used the word clarity a moment ago in the way that we do that. It makes us prepare. And I would also say, don't try to mentor someone if you're not learning. Let's go back to what we started about earlier. You got to be growing if you're going to help somebody else grow. I think it's such a powerful thing.
Yeah. I was in an organization years ago, a volunteer organization, and somebody came up with the idea to expect every leader to mentor somebody. And what we ultimately decided is that would be an aspiration, but we weren't ready because we had leaders who weren't in a credible position to mentor others. We had to go deal with that first. So I'm glad you called that out. But you want to be the leader that's learning and growing so that sharing it with others, paying it forward, is just a normal and natural overflow of the life you're living. And that's really a cool place to live.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, Mark. Okay, we'll land it there. This is, how amazing, Mark, would it be if all the teams in the world were getting smarter all the time? I think the world would be better. And yet anybody who's listening out there, you may not can control what happens with all the teams in the world, but you can create an environment where your team is expected to get smarter and you're doing everything you can to resource that quest. I think if you would just do that, who knows, it might not change the world, but I think it really can change yours. And so that would be our admonition to you, our prayer for you. We're cheering for you. If we can help you, let us know. Please keep sharing with your friends and family. Look for that PDF on the development plan in the show notes, and we'll join you next week. Remember, the best leaders lead every day.